Welcome to the second edition of Putin's War. I'm Mike Graham, this is Talk TV, and I'm in the company of Hugh Andree, and we've also got a special guest coming up which we'll introduce you to in a moment. Hugh, I think our first episode last week went down pretty well. People were very pleased to see the knowledge that you had and the insight that you were able to bring to the party, as it were. What's been happening this week, and what are we doing what are we going to cover today?
Yeah, well, I think just following up from last week, Mike, we talked about morale and the lack of morale that we've seen within the Russian forces and the effect that that has on their fighting force.
Yeah.
And I believe that Putin's actually started setting up recruitment offices along the border to try and capture those individuals.
Persuade them otherwise.
Stop them from leaving.
Right. Yeah, that's quite a frightening prospect, isn't it? And what about some of the developments? We've seen that these referendums have been held.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most would agree that was a bit of a foregone conclusion.
Yes.
The sham referendums that have resulted in 96.6% of those living within the four regions in the south and east voting in favour of being Russian and being part of Russia. What will happen next is on Friday, Putin will put to the Russian parliament a vote to annex those regions. Now, we've seen this before. It happened in 2014 in Crimea. That will happen.
Yeah.
And at that point, that really escalates the crisis quite significantly, because at that point, those regions fall under, they become sovereign territory of Russia.
Right.
What that means is that if you then decide to attack those territories, or in the Ukraine's, for Ukraine, if they seek to win back that territory, that will then be perceived as an attack on Russia.
Yeah.
And that then suddenly escalates the whole crisis, because that then allows Putin, of course, to start talking about his arsenal of weapons.
Yes.
And that includes nuclear weapons.
And it gives him a foothold, technically speaking,
Indeed.
in that part of Ukraine.
does.
Let's introduce our special guest who's here with us, a man you know well, who's just come back from Ukraine. John Chapman, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
for
Pleasure to be here.
coming. Tell us a bit about what you've just been doing, John.
I went to Yarev, which was it's a big military base. NATO had used it a lot for training and stuff, and this base was sort of the hub for all the foreigners coming in. There's a lot of other things as well, and the base itself was attacked, airstriked in March, about 3 days after I left.
Okay.
35 casualties, 35 dead, I think 125 injured. And then from there, I went from there to Kiev, and basically we was thrust into the Battle of Irpin, Moshun and Bucha, all the way along that sort of edge to stop the Russians from advancing any further, which we achieved.
And you're part of an international force. Is that a sort of an official thing, or is it a kind of unofficial?
The Legion is like the French Foreign Legion.
Right.
It's an official thing, so you get an army ID card, everything else.
Right.
But there was two sort of levels. The level I was working with Ukrainian intelligence group, and then you had sort of the other sort of Ukrainian sort of Legion, which were, they'd just take anybody who wanted to fight, no matter their background. Right. They would be given training, so they were separate to us.
Okay.
So,
and is it like street fighting mostly? What sort of fighting?
When I was there, it was quite brutal. It was street fighting. So I was basically, Irpin is like a suburb of Kiev,
right.
And it was fighting through people's homes. Like you'd see children's homework on the table, unfinished DIY projects, unfinished meals, pictures on the wall, and you're fighting through these people's homes.
Because people see, don't they, Hugh, on TV and sometimes on social media, they see sort of footage of what appears to be normal life going on in parts of Ukraine, and you know, they kind of go, well, that doesn't look like a war zone. But war zones, for many people, that, you know, they don't really know what a war zone looks like, and it can look very normal, can't it?
Yeah, I think because people don't realise how vast Ukraine is.
Yeah.
So the war, when I was there, was close to Kiev, but after we stopped them, and they moved back up to Belarus and sort of re-fought their plans. The war obviously moved south and east.
Yeah.
With the Donbass and Luhansk regions, obvious, and down to the Crimea, because they're trying to secure that. So that's where the war moved to. However, as we've seen recently in Kiev thought it was okay, and the shopping centre got missile attacked.
Yeah.
So it's still not a country that's fine to be anywhere.
Right. And as you were sort of there so you've been there pretty much since the beginning.
Yeah.
Until now. Are you going to go back and do you have family here that wonder what you're doing?
I come back because basically my wife wanted me to come back. She had an accident, so I had to come back and help her.
Yeah.
Now I have toyed with the reasons with going back, and I will never say never. But I've had a lot of close calls.
I was going to ask you about that.
I've had a lot of close calls. So when we went down to Mariupol, for instance, we absolutely got hammered with shell fire, and I probably nearly died about 5 times in one day.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to think about, but it's a risk you accept.
Yeah.
And the reason why I was there, I wasn't there for glory. I wasn't there for anything other than it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And are you paid to do it?
Yes, we was eventually.
Yeah.
Was eventually, because you're part of an army.
Yeah.
But again, with the war itself, when I was there, everything else was still trying to catch up.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainian sort of administration side was, fighting, swimming against a really big tide, like things like equipment getting through and stuff like that. NATO and politicians and that hadn't got their backsides in gear to start backing it, but it came, and you're seeing the weapons what Ukrainians now have. German howitzers, American HIMARS rockets. They make a difference because instead of using the 60s generation artillery that they had, the Ukrainians, and dotting around targets, now they can program a shell head, fire it and hit within 10 metres.
Right.
And that's what you see on the telly.
Right, amazing. Hugh, I don't want to monopolise all these questions. We haven't got a great deal of time. What would you ask, John?
Yeah, 2 questions really.
Yep.
Especially for people watching the programme, especially for those who, have military experience. My first question was about what you and I would know as CASEVAC, which actually means casualty evacuation. Now, in an established professional army, which we talked about last week, Mike, that's very well practiced, and it tends to work like clockwork. If you were hit on the battlefield in Helmand, you got attention within minutes. You could be back in a field hospital within an hour, and if you really need to be back in a hospital in the UK in 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Tell us about the CASEVAC process in Ukraine.
The CASEVAC programme was slightly different because we was fighting an enemy with the same capabilities as us, drones, artillery. That played a sort of big role in how we did things. But we had, in our team, we had 2 casualties, but the casualty I'm going to talk about, a guy called Otto. He was shot in the shoulder, and we was trapped in a building. We had a Russian large section outside with a BMP trying to do us in, as it were, and we had to get out of there, and we had to fire a manoeuvre out of that contact. He had to run because he was shot in the shoulder, and he was a very brave guy, and we just had to lift him out like that. But we did have medical equipment like your bandages, tourniquets, but it's just first aid. It's not
pretty basic.
It's not pretty basic. We had nothing like quick clot to stop bleeding or morphine for pain or anything like that.
Field dressings and stuff
just
like
field
that.
just basic.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the stuff that we brought with us. The actual system of it going through, because normally, as Hugh quite rightly said, you go for a system of a chain, as it were. But for us, it was to get out the contact being followed by the Russians, broke contact, and then it was basically get him in an armoured vehicle we had, get him back to sort of the safety of the Ukrainian lines, and then he was just ferried off to hospital in Kiev. But it wasn't, if it had been like Ukraine now is, like I said, a massive country, if it had been in the middle of nowhere, we could have had him for days.
Yeah.
You know, so it just depends. We was lucky where we were, so it just really it's pretty basic. Now that might have moved on since I've left. However, it is something you have to take on, bear in mind if you do this. It's not like the British Army or conventional army. It's quite different to that.
Final question, because we've heard a lot about this in the news and the press, and partly Putin's reason for invading. Did you at any time witness or see right-wing Nazi extremism in any shape or form, or is that really the Russian media machine at play?
I think that's just, obviously, the propaganda war is key, isn't it?
Yeah.
And with the Russians, obviously, they're pressing that button. I see nothing of anything to do with right-wing reasons for being there.
Yep.
And I think where that comes from, before the war in 2014, I think there was militaires in Luhansk and stuff made up of various, very small people, groups, 15, 20 blokes of the military who have right-wing.
Yeah.
But he's used that as a lever to say, encompassing the whole war, and that's just not true.
Okay.
Well, it's one of the many excuses he's used for going in.
Yeah, it's just not true.
No.
But he's
Thanks for clearing that up.
pushed that button.
Great. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. I think we should get you back, though, John, because you've clearly got plenty of stories to tell about what it's really like there.
Okay,
But
glad
thank
to
you
come
very
back.
much for
That's
coming in.
okay.
John Chapman, just back from Ukraine. Hugh Andree as well. We'll be back next week with another episode of Putin's War.